procedures and jump through certain hoops. Wow, you know, Mayapur. Are you from Mayapur? Your face looks familiar, actually.
Yes.
Yeah. Right, so you know. Very, very complicated, you know, very difficult. I often jokingly say to Rojitanya, probably inappropriate, but anyway, you know, Rojitanya, why didn't you appear in, you know, Copenhagen or London or Geneva, well, or maybe there's a better place, Monte Carlo. It's like in Mayapur, they did a survey in Time magazine. I saw this it must be about 15 years ago now, actually. And one of the articles in it was the 10 most corrupt countries in the world. Okay? Of course, this is Time magazine's American, they have their version of events, you know, but anyway, just as an aside. And it listed all the usual suspects. You had, what's the South American countries, the one they don't like? Was it
North Korea?
Colombia? Huh? Russia? It may have been there. Now what's the one they really don't? Venezuela, that's the one they don't like a lot, and of course Cuba. Venezuela was there. There were a few South American countries, a few African countries. I think North Korea, of course, was there. You know, I don't know if Russia was there. But at number one, the most corrupt country in the world, according to these people, was West Bengal, and it had an asterisk beside it. And he went down to the asterisk, and it said, "We know that West Bengal is not a country, it is a state in India. But it is just so corrupt that we had to put it." And that's where we are. So that's there, that's one thing. Then of course Mayapur, not every year, but often floods, which is another big complication to get things done and whatever and all that. Then the other thing, of course, as Prabhupada writes quite a bit about, or mentions quite a lot, is that ever since Prabhupada came to the West, and the whole time Prabhupada was with us, and right up actually until about, about 5 years ago now, I think, it was run by the communists. And it's like, wow, trying to deal with a communist guy. Right? So all those complications. So anyway, it just says here, after many setbacks and local opposition, Prabhupada was eventually able to purchase some land in Mayapur. And of course, Prabhupada, as he said himself many times, I am a Calcutta man, so he's a local person, and he had big problems trying to do this. As soon as he had bought the land in Mayapur, he says, "We propose to hold a nice festival there for Janmashtami Day for 2 weeks. At that time, the foundation stone for the temple will be set down. I wish that all our leading disciples come to India at that time. There are 50 branches, so at least one from each branch should attend this function." That was written on the 28th of May 1971 to Govinda Dasi again. So as soon as we got the land, Prabhupada held the festival, and the central part of that festival was he was laying a foundation stone. That was 1971. We started, I suppose, when did we put the first pile in, We started, I've been getting all the permissions to build this temple. It went on for years and years and years and years and years to finally get the permission. And it was like, what a celebration when we actually got the final piece of paper that said we could start building a temple for Lord Chaitanya in his Prabhupada Desh. They eventually allowed us to do it. So about 3 years ago we started putting those piles in. I was in Mayapur for some of the time when they were putting those piles in, and at that stage I was staying right in the long building right beside where the temple was being built. And honest to God, my room was 225. You go to sleep in room 225 and you wake up in room 228, because then just this kind of, you literally are bouncing in your bed all night while you're trying to sleep. Because those piles, there's 3,000 of them, and I think from memory they're 150 meters, I think, is that 150 meters? And they have to be pounded down, 3,000 pounded down 100 feet into the ground. And the reason for that is again because of the soil that the temple is being built on. You can't get, there's no rock basically, you know, it's all clay and mud and clay. So those piles are put in and they act like a kind of floating foundation, and then the building is actually attached to those 3,000 piles, all the key points like that. So all this incredible endeavour because of the local situation. But anyway, 71, 3 years ago, or 2014, say 2011, so it's 40 years. 40 years after Prabhupada wrote this, we actually started the construction. And all, of course, we all have to pay our obeisances also, of course, to Ambarish Prabhu, who was the person who's put up a huge chunk of that. Although his commitment has now been spent. So now we have to fundraise for the rest. But I mean, he's given the lion's share of it. So that's our central challenge. I just finished on this. Our central challenge, meaning ISKCON now, follows of Prabhupada. After establishing the GBC, Prabhupada stated that he wanted there to be hundreds and thousands of spiritual masters within ISKCON. It's a very famous quote from Prabhupada. He said it a couple of times. He wants hundreds and thousands of spiritual. Now, why does he want hundreds and thousands of spiritual masters? I'm on camera, so I have to be a little bit careful, but you know, he didn't want hundreds of thousands of spiritual masters so they could all have elaborate Vyasa Puja ceremonies. That actually wasn't the reason that Prabhupada said we need hundreds of thousands of spiritual masters. The reason he said it was because the only way Krishna consciousness will spread is if you have people preaching Krishna consciousness. And those people who preach Krishna consciousness are essentially gurus. There's all different types of gurus, of course. But essentially a preacher of Krishna consciousness is a guru like that. So Prabhupada, again going back to the point about delivering suffering humanity, that's why Prabhupada wanted hundreds of thousands of spiritual masters, to deliver suffering humanity like that. He implied that the normative guru-disciple relationship would be perpetuated within the unified institution under the direction of a GBC. And that's the central challenge, because traditionally, as you know, in India, you become a guru, and that's it, you're in charge, you've got your disciples, there's no other interference. That isn't our system in ISKCON. That is not our system in ISKCON, and the reason it's not our system is because it's not the system Prabhupada wanted. Prabhupada wanted a system where all of the spiritual masters, they have their disciples in their relationship, but they all work under the authority of a governing board. Once that doesn't happen, and you know, in this room, I'm sure you're all disciples. So you have a responsibility also to make sure that we follow Prabhupada's instruction in this regard. Because once that doesn't happen, that they don't work under the authority of a governing board, then the exact same thing that happened in 1936 when Bhaktisiddhanta Maharaj left will happen to ISKCON. You will just have individual branches with the guru in charge, and that's not what Prabhupada wanted. So it's our central challenge. Maintaining and increasing cooperation between the GBC and all the devotees, perhaps most important of all, cooperation between the GBC and ISKCON gurus. Oh yeah, the final thing, story. When Prabhupada, I don't know if you've heard the story, I've heard it relatively recently. When Prabhupada was in his room in 1977 in Vrindavan, prior to him leaving, every day Tamal Krishna Maharaj would read out the letters that Prabhupada has received from whoever, like that, disciples and whoever else. And one day they got this letter from a disciple, and the disciple said in the letter, in essence, that, Prabhupada, I have nothing to offer you. The only thing I can offer you is my longevity. That, in other words, the disciple was essentially saying, I will give you my body. Now, of course, we know there's some stories in Bhagavatam where transformation of bodies and all that, but in reality it was quite a sentimental thing for the person to say. It was a nice sentiment, but it was kind of sentimental. He was basically saying, Prabhupada, you take my body, my new young body, and then you can continue on here, with your ISKCON. Now, aside from the fact it can't be done, the point is that new young body, which was probably already maybe late 20s, early 30s, that also will get old anyway, so eventually this situation will come. Anyway, Prabhupada's reaction to that was, this is not important. He dismissed the letter, he just didn't talk about it. This is not important. In other words, kind of like whatever. But then he went on to say, the only thing that's important is our cooperation with one another. And we know the famous quote, the famous cooperation quote. But that's what preceded it. This letter being read out to Prabhupada, someone was offering Prabhupada their body. But I said, that's not important. The only thing that's important is how you cooperate after I've left. Cooperating. And then Prabhupada, to quote from the Chaitanya Charitamrita on this point about cooperation, the Ekaki Amara and Mahipaya Bola verse, where Chaitanya Mahaprabhu himself talks about cooperation, where he says he does not know how he will be able to continue with the Sankirtan movement, able to propagate the Sankirtan movement unless he has the help of all of the devotees. So that's Krishna himself saying that he needs cooperation. So what to speak of us? We have no chance whatsoever unless we cooperate together. Yeah, I think I'll finish there. It is late, I'm really sorry about that. Sorry. But if anybody has any comments or questions, then I will now let Madhvashara who will determine.
Let's take some questions.
Okay, and you can tell us when to stop. Any comments or questions? Yes.
I don't know practically, hardly nothing. I just read about this, with some Mataji's that were Prabhupada disciples, they feel like the mood is not so much like when Prabhupada was here, regarding them. I don't know if it is an important topic or not. I was just wondering a little bit about it, just that they should also feel, encouraged and included and like that.
I think it's a very important topic, and I think that you're correct. I think an argument can be made to say that since Prabhupada's physical departure, the ladies in his movement have arguably suffered more than anybody else and any other part of his movement. I mean, you can certainly make an argument for children also, you can definitely make that argument as well. But certainly, without a shadow of a doubt. And it goes back to this point I made earlier about unity and diversity, that one thing that we have to be unified on is that we're all eternal spirit souls, and that we should act on the platform of being eternal spirit souls, and not get sidetracked by bodily designation or whatever that bodily designation may be, whether it's male, female, black, white, European, Indian, etc. And I think that, due to lack of Krishna consciousness, lack of maturity, that we certainly had, and still to some degree have, a tendency to take shelter in those those bodily designations. That's the way the material world works. You see it. You see it. This thing that happened in France last week, or whenever it was. It's kind of like when things like that happen. Certain people, not all people, but certain people. Not an excuse, maybe the wrong word, because as I say, it's an insecurity. But there's a tendency for people to rally together based on their own bodily identification and their skin colour, etc., their religion or their ethnic background. And, as long as we're not on the pure platform, we also succumb to those things, or at least the potential is there for us to succumb to those things. So certainly I think Srila Prabhupada was a sannyasi. So we can all read in Prabhupada's books his clear instructions about the association of the opposite sex. I mean, there's so many of them, and they're so strong and powerful. But yet he himself, because he was on the pure platform, he was able to engage with and deal with his female disciples in a loving and friendly way, without transgressing any many aspects of etiquette or dharma as far as his ashram is concerned. Whereas if we're not on that platform, sometimes the easier way for people to deal with it is by becoming very strict and rigid and strong and things, which is okay as long as it doesn't cross a line where it becomes actually impersonal and even worse. I mean, not just a case of being impersonal, but a case of actually in some cases where real poor mistreatment took place. I think that going forward, that as we mature as an organisation, and also as individuals mature, because when you think about it, I mean, I think Harikesh ex-Swami was the GBC of this part of the world for a long, long time. I always find it interesting, when you read about him, I think, unless this information is wrong, because somebody contested me on it one time, but this is definitely what I read in one of those diaries. Again, it was one of the Saturn Merge books, one of those little red books that you used to, probably Nectar, probably none of you have ever seen those little books. But Harikesh apparently joined in 1972, at least according to what I read in that book. So let's just, for the sake of this discussion, accept that as being true. So he joined in 1972, and Prabhupada left in 1977. So you have 5 years of instructions from Prabhupada, and it wouldn't have been with him all the time. And I think again, I could be wrong, but I think he was 26, I think, when Prabhupada left, I think, something like that. So 26 years of age, and you're given the role of GBC, Guru, BBT trustee, and whatever else, It's quite an onerous responsibility at such a young age, 26. Now, in ISKCON in those days, there would have been one or two exceptions, I suppose, but essentially, you didn't have anybody out of their 30s, Whereas if you look in this room now, is there anybody in their 20s? There probably is. There you go, don't worry, you'll be in your 30s soon, in your 40s, in your 50s, don't worry about it. Time. That's how I know that I still want to be the centre of the universe, and I still want to be Krishna, because, boy would I love to be able to control time. Anyway, so it passes up quickly. But my point is that at that time in ISKCON, this lady who put her hand up and these two brahmacharis who put their hands up, the GBCs were your age. They were your age. The gurus were your age. That's just the reality. So mistakes were made through immaturity. But it was like when Prabhupada went to Australia, he installed Radha in Sydney. What was it, Radha? What was the name of it? Anyway, he installed the deities in Sydney. And his final words to the deities were, none of these people are qualified, or none of these people are trained in anything to do with worshipping, deity worship, Panchashtra Deity, whatever. None of them know anything. So I'm leaving it. So Krishna, I'm leaving it to you to train them up. Prabhupada often said that it's an emergency situation. We're in a war against Maya. You take risks. Risks are taken. So one of those risks it wasn't really a risk, there was absolutely nothing Prabhupada could do about it, was that when he left in 1977, all his leaders were in their 20s, maybe one or two of them were in their 30s, but most of them were in their 20s. And some mistakes were made, but I think that just through a combination of that maturing process, combination of the movement being bigger, and even the GBC in those days, I wasn't involved, of course, but I've heard these stories quite a few times from people who were involved. GBC meetings used to be, they'd be throwing chairs at each other. I think that's a little exaggerated, but still, the point being that everyone was in their room and it was like, that doesn't happen anymore. That doesn't, it's a much more collegiate mood, wanting to do what's best for the society, best for preaching, best for the devotees, what would make Prabhupada proud, like that. It's just a more mature and collegiate kind of mood. And I think, we put all these different, still we could do more. I'm not trying to say we couldn't do more, but, we have a Child Protection Office. We never had a Child Protection Office, that was 1990, I think, the Child Protection, that was the first one that came, and we have a women's ministry now. Different, we have our ISKCON Resolve and our ombuds efforts and all these kind of things, different mechanisms are put in place, because as we grow, more and more social issues have to be dealt with as an organisation, as a society, which is another one of these challenges I mentioned in the beginning. Because again, when we were all joining in the late 70s and early 80s, you didn't do anything but preach. It was just preach. But then when you preach, you know, people join, and then you have to manage that dynamic. You know, it's just part of it. So I think there's still loads to do, but I think at least from a conceptual point of view, I think the leaders in the GBC understand that we have to work on all these social issues and dealing properly with all our different aspects of our society. But just to finish and go back to what I said at the very, very beginning, I think definitely the women got a much rougher deal out of it when Prabhupada left than the men did, that's for sure. Of course, in the ultimate issue, you know, everybody gets exactly what they deserve, and so the men, for whatever wrongdoings they did, are going to get what they, you know. But still, just on a social level, I think that the women and children definitely got a worse deal than the men did.
It's also because I read so much about Yamuna's book. I haven't read it, but Yamuna Devi, and then when I read all these people who get inspired by the book, then I just feel a bit wondering that, you know, we didn't hear so much about her before she
passed away.
Yeah.
You know, I was at Manor for the weekend, last weekend, and I was talking with Dan Jan, Prabhupada disciple Dan Jan, excuse me, and he was telling me that, well, what happened, well, one of the things that was happening when I was there was that for us in the UK, maybe it's kind of a bit of a historic thing, conscious of time again, but you know, one of the first GBCs in the UK, I can't name him because he's passed away, Jai Tirtha, he set up ISKCON in the UK, again against Prabhupada's instructions. He set it up as one central charity, ISKCON UK, and all the different temples, Bhaktivedanta Manor, South Street, Manchester, Newcastle, Coventry, Leicester, Birmingham, Wales, all these different temples were just under that one legal entity. And Prabhupada didn't want that. Prabhupada said, no, everything should be separate. So we've been working for years and years and years, because it's complicated, I won't get into details, but it gets complicated to unravel that. But we've done it now. Soho is now a completely separate charity. And Bhaktivedanta Manor had their first ISKCON Bhaktivedanta Manor legal entity, their first meeting last Sunday as a separate charity, so they're now also separate from ISKCON UK. And it's not quite as simple as that. Well, there's more to it, but I'm not going to get into it. So it was kind of an historic meeting. You know, Bhaktivedanta Manor was purchased in 1973, so what we now, whatever that is, 40 years or whatever, I don't know, my brain doesn't work so quickly now. But you know, it's like nearly 40 years, is it? Or even more than 40 years? 42, thanks. Thanks, Janelle, I appreciate it. So 42 years later, they're now functioning as Prabhupada wanted to function in terms of being separate like that. So it was a little bit of a party in that sense, a really nice time. And Dan Jai was there, and I was talking to him, and he said to me, Pragosh, do you know who the first temple president of Bhaktivedanta Manor was? Now, the way he asked the question, I kind of guessed. And he says, wasn't you by any chance? And he was laughing because he knew. He says, yeah. He says, do you know how long I lasted as temple president? And I said, no. He says, approximately 1.5 hours. God, what did you do? That's really quick, you know? He says, no, what happened was Prabhupada appointed him temple president. So not only was he temple president, he was appointed directly by Prabhupada to be the temple president. And of course, in those days, you know, relatively small numbers of devotees compared to now, whatever. So and everyone would have been living in the building. So it spread very quickly that, you know, our first temple president is going to be Dan Jai, or is Dan Jai. Within, he said, you know, 15 minutes or 20 minutes, you know, a group of devotees, who will remain nameless because they're still around, whatever like that, 3 or 4 of them, like that, senior kind of devotees, leaders, whatever, they went to Prabhupada, and they objected. And they said, well, no, I don't think he's the right choice. So they went and lobbied Prabhupada. And Prabhupada acquiesced. Not that he agreed, but he acquiesced, you know. And there are many, many examples of that, you know, where it may not have been Prabhupada's first choice, but because of dynamics and people and this and that, and trying to balance everything and keep everything spinning nicely and whatever, that he would then, you know, compromise, you know. So I say that in the context of Yamuna and the role that Prabhupada wanted for her and maybe other women, etc., in different situations. That, you know, we know the famous time when the sannyasis went to Prabhupada. I mean, that's why the history of this one is really interesting. That's why all our congregation members should read all these letters and conversations, because it's very, very interesting stuff, you know. At one time the GBC was all sannyasis, another time it was all grihastas. There's all reasons behind that, you know. But the point is that Prabhupada, you know, devotees would, you know, harass him, you know, I suppose is the best way to put it. And, you know, so different decisions were made at different times and all that kind of thing. You know, so. Yes?
This quote about cooperation, I understand it's in full context of Prabhupada. I don't think it's not recorded. It's only from devotees' memory.
Yes.
But isn't it that it's your love for people demonstrated by how much you cooperate to keep this institution going when I'm not here?
Yeah.
That's kind of because it's
after I leave, which is the same thing. But as you say, we can't find it recorded. It's one of those very frustrating things. There's another one like that. It's that where Prabhupada supposedly says, and some devotees are adamant in say, that he only considers a devotee blut, was the word we used to use, when they go back to eating meat. Then he would consider them, you know. But again, we can't find the evidence of that quote. So similarly, yeah, we can't find it. But that's what you said is
Because my point is that it's not that we just sit down and cooperate, but actually there's a specific object we have to cooperate around that keep his institution going.
Yeah.
It's we cannot like cooperate for a good cinema tour or something like that. Or
yeah, absolutely. How do you cooperate to push on this movement after that point? Yeah. And then it was just in the context of that thing about that devotee. He's cooperating and saying, I'll give you my body. And that's not important. What's important is how you all cooperate to push on. Okay, I think I should stop there, right? Because otherwise it just gets kind of very, very late. It's 9:20. Thank you all very much. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Hare.